Aloha, my name is June, and today's video will be on the topic of, you guessed it, resin. Now, the question of resin is probably the most brought up, especially in the beginning of the journey, which sometimes can be overwhelming. I know it was for me in regards to what resin should I be using. So today I want to share a little bit of, some information and hopefully offer some sort of guide into what may work well for you and where to begin and what resin to work with, okay? So there are three types of resin that are used initially for arts and crafts and DIY home projects and things like that. And those three resins would be epoxy, polyester, and polyurethane. So I'm going to discuss share a little bit of information on the three, and then we'll just take it from there. So the first resin that I mentioned is epoxy. Okay, so epoxy is a really wonderful resin for so many reasons. I find the most user-friendly and the most forgiving, and you'll see why. So the first thing I want to say about epoxy resin is actually the least toxic resin out of the three that I mentioned, okay? So what this means is when working with epoxy resin, you're not going to need a respirator mask, first of all. The fumes that are created through the chemicals and the process and the mixing and everything it's like least hazardous than the other two. So epoxy resin is more environmentally friendly and the least toxic out of the three. And of course you're going to be wanting to work in a ventilated space. You know what I'm saying? You're going to want some sort of ventilation. But the thing about epoxy is you're actually going to be able to work with it in maybe like a studio or in a room. And you won't need to like open every single window, or you won't need to be working outside or anything like that. So it's actually, quite much more safer to use indoors. Another thing about epoxy resin is that it has a longer pot time, meaning once the resin has been mixed together, the resin and the hardener has been mixed together, the curing process takes a lot more longer than the other two. So this gives you a lot more time to work with the resin, which is very important, especially when it comes to when you're making a bit more intricate designs in your work, and you're not just making like regular like tower busters or anything like that. You're gonna want a lot more pot time, or I'd even say that it's more convenient to have that pot time. So epoxy resin is amazing, and it's perfect for that in that way, that it gives you a lot more time to actually work with your creation. But one thing that I can say about epoxy resin is that it is the most softest resin out of the bunch. So what does this mean? So once it's done and cured, being that it's softer than polyester and polyurethane, epoxy resin is much more easier to dent or to scratch. So for example, like let's say you're making a pyramid and you want that high gloss, really hard finish to your work. Polyester and polyurethane would be the way to go, in the sense that once it cures very glass-like, and it's much more harder to scratch or to dent polyester and polyurethane versus epoxy. Now, the thing about polyester and polyurethane is it is very highly toxic, way more toxic than epoxy. And it is definitely necessary to have some sort of protection and to wear a respirator mask when working with polyester and polyurethane. those fumes have a tendency to, you don't want to like burn your nostrils, and you don't want to inhale all of those toxic chemicals. So a respirator mask is definitely recommended. And also you would need lots of ventilation, open windows, open doors, maybe even working with it outdoors. Not to mention, you will also be needing to wear the respirator mask at the same time as well. So polyester and polyurethane is very toxic, but at the same time, it has, once it's finished and cured, it has that nice hardness to it, and it cures in a glass-like way. Now, the other thing about polyester and polyurethane that you need to understand and look out for is that it does have a much more shorter pot time than epoxy. So we're talking like it will cure in a span of like minutes, like maybe 10 to 15 minutes. You can find something that, formulated to cure to have a much more longer pot time, but generally polyester and polyurethane have a short pot time, meaning you don't really have a lot of time to work with these resins. So if you're much more experienced with working with resin, polyester and polyurethane you might find it to be less challenging, in the sense of you like I said, you have more experience, you know what you're doing, you have your techniques down, so it'll be easier to work with. But if you're in the beginning stages of working with resins, then epoxy is definitely much more user friendly, in the sense that it does give you that time to work and refine your technique. Okay. Another thing about that I have to note about polyurethane is insanely and extremely sensitive to moisture. And when I say sensitive, I mean sensitive in every way. Like, even having too much humidity in the air will affect how polyurethane resin cures. Okay. So it won't cure all the way. It'll still remain sticky if there's any, like, let's say maybe even if it's raining outside, or you just live in a tropical kind of environment where there's a lot of humidity in the air, you might find it challenging to work with polyurethane. So you would need to be in like a really dry space. Maybe you live in the desert and the air is really dry. Then polyurethane won't be so difficult to work with, but it is very sensitive. And also, if you're wanting to work with other elements to your craft, to your Orgonite, like colloidal metals and ormus, and you want to work with the more alchemical processes, which I will be discussing in future videos, then you're definitely not going to want to work with polyurethane, in the sense of, like, if you add any liquids whatsoever, it's just not going to work. It's not going to cure the way that it at all. Okay, basically. So, and even with pigments and colors, like let's say you want to add colors and you want like to make really colorful and pretty Orgonites, if you're working with polyurethane, you're going to need to work with pigments and dyes that are especially formulated for polyurethane. Okay, versus epoxy. I mean, I love epoxy because with epoxy resin, you can pretty much like add anything and it will still cure as it's supposed to, as it should. It'll cure all the way, and you won't have any problems when working with epoxy. And yeah, I would consider it to be a little bit more of like I said, it's user friendly, more like a universal resin. So some tips and advice with resins is, so the first thing, which I learned the hard way, okay, is that all resins, no matter what kind of resin that you use or work with, all resins, they do turn yellow over time. So, especially when they're exposed to UV or the sun, the yellowing will happen faster. But over time, no matter what resin you work with, it will turn it will turn yellow over time. Now, if you're like a beginner and you're not really worried about the coloration or the yellowing, and you just want something to work with to practice, or maybe you just want to gift the environment or the neighborhood or whatever. And if that doesn't matter, fine. That's great. It does just it's not that big of a deal. But if you don't, let's say you're making jewelry, or later on down the line you want to, gift them out to friends or whatnot, and you don't want that yellowing to occur, make sure you find a resin that is especially formulated to have an anti-yellowing or resistant anti-yellowing property to it, okay? And that's resistant to yellowing. So there are resins that are formulated to not have that yellowing over time, which is incredible. Because, like I said, when I first started out, I was making all these beautiful, wonderful pieces, but then I wouldn't understand why, for the life of me, why they were all turning yellow. You know what I'm saying? And it, used to really bother me. So then I found that you have to actually find a resin that has an anti-yellowing effect to it, property to it. So it's formulated to resist yellowing over time, which is incredible, and it's amazing. Such a huge difference. Especially if you're, like I said, because Orgonite is more than just, it's wonderful for protection and transmutating and cleaning the environment, but it's also artistic. And, being an artist, you want your work to look great, right? And you don't want that, the yellowing. So you want to work with a clear resin. You have to make sure that it is a clear resin that has anti-yellowing. Otherwise, a typical resin will have to begin with, it'll have an amber or a yellow color to it. So you want to look for something that's clear and anti-yellowing. I just had to put that out there. Epoxy resin, there are different types. If you're, concerned about the environment and being if you're super eco-friendly, there are epoxy resins that are actually eco-friendly. So I do highly recommend into looking and doing some research into more eco-friendlier resin. Epoxy resin, again, is also great for jewelry in the sense of the toxicity and the pot time. It's more convenient to work with in the design element aspect, in the sense of it gives you more time to work with the resin, and again, it's much more forgiving. So I would say the main two resins at the end of the day that Orgonite artists use are epoxy resins and polyester resins. Okay, so I'm just gonna go. I just noted a few differences between the two. So what's the difference between the epoxy and the polyester? Besides toxicity and pot time, there are actually some more key differences between the two. Okay, so the first one that I noted is so epoxy actually has is actually stronger, has a stronger bond strength than polyester, and also epoxy is more resistant to wearing and tearing and cracking and peeling, which you'll find when you're experimenting. The polyester has a tendency to, depending on how much you pour at a time, a polyester tends to crack a lot more, which can be very, very frustrating. So polyester is prone to cracking and tearing versus cracking and wearing versus epoxy resin. Also, epoxy is it's moisture resistant, while polyester is considered to be water permeable. So epoxy resin is much more resistant to liquids, which is awesome. And also another good thing about epoxy that I have to note, that it has a much more longer shelf life than polyester resin. So the good thing about epoxy is it will last. You could just store it somewhere safe and cool, in a cool, safe place, and it will last years. You know what I'm saying? With the same amount of potency. versus polyester maybe has a shelf life of around 6 to 12 months. So you're gonna have to like work with it right away. I mean, everything about polyester resin is like, it's like, I mean, it doesn't have a long, it has a very short pot time, has a shorter pot time, and you have to use it, and it has a shorter shelf lifetime as well. So, I mean, all in all, there is no best resin to use. You know, don't be afraid to experiment and see what works with you. But what I would recommend is for a beginner, epoxy resin may be the way that you want to go. Again, epoxy resins are much more user-friendly and much more forgiving in the sense of A, they're less toxic, and B, you have a lot more time to work with the resin. So personally, I actually do work with epoxy resin in most of my creations for those two reasons, especially for the design element, because I focus a lot more on the jewelry aspect. I make a lot of amulets, so epoxy resin is great for that because it gives you a lot of time to work and design, you know, the layout of the crystals that you're working with. Also, when it comes to alchemy, which I will be, I think I mentioned it earlier, that I will be discussing in future videos. Epoxy is awesome to work with when you're wanting to add different things like, you know, liquid metals and ormus. So with epoxy is you could add different liquids and other elements in it and it will cure just the same, versus the other resins may not, right, it will definitely not cure the same way or at all, and it might remain a little sticky or wet or tacky, and you definitely don't want that. So if you're on the path of, you know, wanting to work a little bit more with the alchemy, then epoxy is definitely the way to go. Before I forget, I do want to mention something that has a question that has came up not too long ago by a fellow Orgonite artist, and it is in regards to organic resins. Now, the resins that I just mentioned today, the epoxy, polyester, polyurethane, those would be considered synthetic resins because they are man-made. There are such things as organic resins that consist of amber, pine resins, you know, tree resins, resins that come from the natural world that are organic. But the thing with this is, well, first of all, is the process is quite different in the sense of it is a heating and cooling process. So the way these natural resins work is you would have to heat it to a degree to where it becomes a liquid form, and then you pour it, and then it cools and it dries into whatever mold or whatever you cast it into. Now, if you are working with a natural resin, know that it will function differently in the sense of the synthetic resins has something called a curing. So once a resin cures, it shrinks, and that shrinkage is important to hold the quartz crystals in that tight space to create that electrical charge. Now, without the curing and the shrinking, okay, if you're working with an organic or a natural resin, it's not going to create the same charge and that same electrical effect. It'll just be more like it's just being suspended in the resin versus the actual having that charge. And we need that charge to have that, to help with the transmutation and the clearing of the energy. So I just wanted to put that out there that yes, you can, there are natural organic resins that you can use, but it will work differently. So yeah, I hope this video finds you well and it's been helpful on your journey to your Orgonite creations. And I'll definitely leave a link below to my blog that I written about this topic, and a link to further information in regards to the key differences between epoxy and polyester. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.